This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. I have to tell you now, this country is at war with Germany.
Ich habe nun über 6 Jahre am Aufbau der deutschen Wehrmacht gearbeitet. Es sind in dieser Zeit über 90 Milliarden für den Aufbau dieser Wehrmacht angewendet worden. Sie ist heute die bestausgerüstete, sich beide Militär vergleichen mit der des Jahres 1914. Ein Vertrauen auf sie ist unerschütterlich.
The war began when the leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. He did this to reclaim the land taken from Germany in World War I, and to begin the hallmark efforts of the anti-Semitic Nazi campaign to oppress the Jewish people. 2 days after the Poland invasion, the country's allies, Great Britain and France, declared war on Germany. 2 years later, Japan, being one of Germany's allies, readjusted their war efforts in the direction of the westmost territory of the United States, Hawaii. In December of 1941, an attack was carried out on Pearl Harbor in the hopes that it would do enough damage to lessen the resistance expected in conquering Southeast Asia. After this crucial moment in the war sequence of events, the United States officially became part of World War II, as stated by Franklin D. Roosevelt in his Day of Infamy speech.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Given the nature of the all-out conflict with the Axis powers, intelligence regarding the movements of the opposing military groups was essential, and despite the Allied powers' best efforts at using methods of secrecy, such as different name ciphers, the Axis powers were able to decode just about every message. This raised several new dangers for the US and its allies, the most important being the lack of integrity and the confidentiality of their military developments and strategies. To mediate these dangers, the US needed to develop a new code. They had already implemented codes based on the language of other native tribes. Among these were the Comanches, Choctaws, Hopis, Cherokees, and others. However, these were too easily decoded. Instead, the United States needed to find another language upon which they can base a new code, a language so infrequently taught and used hardly anyone in the US knew it existed. And through 1941 and 1942, they did just that. The Marine Corps recruited Navajo code talkers. In May of 1942, the first 29 Navajo natives were recruited and sent to a camp where they began their intense training. The Navajos had to train for battle, learning how to survive in dangerous conditions while simultaneously creating their secret code, which at first consisted of 211 words. The code was structured in a code within a code fashion. Every letter in the English alphabet had a code word, and that code word would be then translated into the Navajo language. The Navajo language itself was already difficult to understand because there was no written documentation of it. But the double coding strategy assured that the rival countries would not be able to decode the messages. Once the code was completed, 25 of the original 29 Navajos were sent to the Pacific to begin their task of conveying messages. The remaining 4 of the original 29 stayed behind at the camp to teach the future Navajo soldiers the secret code. Soon, more than 200 Navajos were being used as code talkers.
In Navajo, it was Daki-Tien, and that's hummingbird in the Navajo language. Say you wanted to give the rank of maybe the commanding officer, who might be a captain. And so to say captain, we would use the term railroad track, and so we would say in Navajo 2 tracks, besh na kie, 2 irons.
The Navajo natives were essential for America's success during World War II. During their training, the Navajos had to learn how to operate both radio and wired communications equipment so that they could effectively use both in the heat of battle. The Navajo natives also had to have the code memorized so that they could translate the messages without hesitation. Depending on the importance of the message, the Navajo soldiers would sometimes just relay them in English, but sometimes the messages were too crucial to take the risk of the enemies hearing it. Rival countries such as Japan had their own code breakers who listened to the codes that the Americans were transferring through their radios, trying to learn the course of action. However, the Japanese were ultimately never able to break the code due to the complexity of the Navajo language. By the end of World War II, on September 2, 1945, about 400 Navajo natives had served as code talkers. Their code was never broken. In Europe, the war ended when the powerful forces of Britain, France, the United States, and Canada united and drove the Nazis back to Germany. The Nazis had been defeated and were forced to surrender. The Americans learned that the Nazis had a plan to utilize experimental atom bomb-based weaponry, and in response, they created their own. The Americans had hoped to use their nuclear weapons on the Nazis, but since they had already been defeated, the Americans changed their focus and aimed their bombs at Japan. In August of 1945, America dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, causing the death of 80,000 people. Soon after, the Americans dropped another bomb on the city of Nagasaki, killing nearly 40,000 more people. Japan had no choice but to surrender as well. World War II is considered to be the deadliest international conflict ever, resulting in the deaths of up to 80 million people. Many people opposed the idea of having Navajo natives fight in a war alongside the American soldiers. However, in sharing the harsh experiences that accompany participating in war, they came to accept one another. They learned that they had more similarities than differences, as all they wanted was to remain safe and return home to their families and loved ones. So, the Navajo natives and American soldiers protected and helped each other through the terrors of war, eventually leading them to create bonds through communication in spite of their differences. Communication had a significant role in the Americans' victory during World War II and provided a gateway to new perspectives on interactions between unfamiliar cultures.